Good evening and welcome everyone. My name is Mike Kane and I'm happy to welcome you to tonight's panel discussion on just price and a coronavirus vaccine. The discussion tonight is being co-presented by the Program for Research on Religion and Urban Civil Society at the University of Pennsylvania, where I'm a senior associate, and by the Collegium Institute for Catholic Thought and Culture, where I direct the program in the philosophy of finance. I'd like to thank our co-sponsors of tonight's event, which include the Penn Initiative for the Study of Markets, the Las Casas Institute at Blackfriars, the UNESCO Chair in Bioethics and Human Rights, and the Fung Global Fellows Program at Princeton's Institute for International and Regional Studies. I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight. I think this is a really timely topic, and I think it demonstrates the ways in which contemporary economics, moral theology, and the history of philosophy intersect and can converse with each other in a way that's relevant to contemporary decision-making. Our panel tonight is moderated by Claudio Lucarelli, who is an associate professor of healthcare management at the Wharton School. Claudio?
Thank you, Mike. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this wonderful event. The current pandemic has introduced many changes in the way we live and how we think of the world going forward. So facing this public health emergency has been a tremendous challenge for all countries in the world. And the complexity needs the collaboration of experts from many disciplines. There's no field that actually has all the answers. And as we will see today, an interdisciplinary dialogue is necessary to find the solutions that are technically sound and also ethically acceptable. New vaccines are being developed. They are much needed by everyone in the world. However, the pricing and the allocation of these vaccines present an interesting problem that includes important ethical considerations. Today, we have three exceptional speakers who are going to share their views, and we'll have what I'm sure will be a fascinating interdisciplinary discussion. Let me start introducing first Professor Jesus Fernandez Villaverde. He's a professor of economics at the University of Pennsylvania, a faculty fellow of Collegium, and also a co-founder and vice president of CREDO, the Catholic Research Economics Discussion Organization. We also have today with us Dr. Tana de Campos. She's a research associate at the Las Casas Institute of the Blackfriars of the University of Oxford and assistant professor of the School of Government at the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile. She's the author of the book Global Health Crisis, Ethical Responsibilities. And our third speaker today will be Dr. John Bushman, who is the executive director of the Beatrice Institute and a moral theologian. His work is at the intersection of ethical theory and Catholic social thought and economics. So the format today, we'll have each of our speakers talking for about 8 minutes, and then we'll have a discussion among the panelists, followed by questions from the audience. To submit your questions, please use the Q&A feature of the Zoom platform. And let's get started and have our first speaker, Professor Jesus Fernandez Villaverde. Please go ahead, Jesus.
Okay. Thanks for having me here. And I guess that my role during these first 8 minutes is try to frame the discussion from the perspective of economics and help to lay down the foundations of what Claudio was referring as the technical aspects of this talk. So when we start explaining economics to undergrads in their freshman year, we usually highlight that economics is divided in 2 parts. One part is usually known as positive economics, and is the technical analysis of the outcomes that certain environments produces. So think about how we analyze, for instance, markets that are competitive or markets that are controlled by a monopolist. The second half of economics is what we usually call normative economics, which tries to build normative statements that involve some valuations about the outcomes that this environment produce. In this second part of economics, economists tend to value market outcomes favorably because you can show that in a large class of environments, such outcomes satisfy several conditions which we find attractive. One of them, for instance, is optimality, that we cannot reallocate resources in society to make someone better off without making someone else worse off. Of course, optimality in its purest form is hard to achieve, but we tend to believe that in many situations you get sufficiently close to optimality that we consider that the market outcome can be valued favorably. However, we also know, and this is in fact part of my own teaching every year to both undergraduate and graduate students, that this type of conditions that deliver good outcomes with respect to markets do not really hold when we are talking about research and development. And a vaccine is the perfect example, which in fact I often use in my own lectures. Research and development of new ideas, and a vaccine is just a new idea, it's just a way to produce some chemical compound or some biological compound that protects us against an illness, is a situation where we have very, very high fixed cost. What do I mean by fixed cost? I mean all the cost of developing and testing the vaccine, which we know can be up to several $1 billion. And yet the marginal cost, which is the cost of producing just one extra dose of the vaccine, is close to zero. Once we have learned how to manufacture a vaccine that is successful, having like one more dose is pretty much free. Well, the standard optimality condition that we teach undergrads is that prices should be equal to marginal cost. But if marginal cost is close to zero, the price should be close to zero. But if we actually follow such a rule, there is no way in which we will ever recover the fixed cost of research and development. And that's why all advanced economists in the English-speaking world since the 18th century have tried to get around this problem of recovering the fixed cost of research and development by creating what we call a legal monopoly on ideas. And we usually call these legal monopolies patents or copyrights. Basically, what a patent or a copyright is nothing more than the right that the legal system gives the holder of the patent to prevent other people from using the same idea. Calling these legal monopolies intellectual property, which is the common terminology, is somewhat disingenuous. Think about this tie that I'm wearing, and the fact that I'm wearing this tie, which is mine, means that no one else can wear this tie at the same time. However, when I invent a vaccine, the fact that I'm producing this vaccine is not really precluding anyone else from producing his own vaccines, because the ideas can be shared without any problem whatsoever. Economists highlight that in that sense, intellectual property is not really property in the sense understood in the Western legal tradition for centuries. And the very same fact that patents or copyrights are limited in time and that there are some ways in which you sometimes can use them. For example, I can always cite a copyrighted book when I'm writing a critical review of it in a newspaper, illustrates that intellectual property is not really property in the traditional sense. Furthermore, the legal system is arbitrary or pragmatic, pick your favorite word, in assigning these legal monopolies. Think about a piece of software. If I write a software program, I can copyright it and protect it. However, if I develop a new mathematical theorem, as I do in my own research, that theorem cannot be copyrighted. And yet, you can show that the lines of software code and a mathematical theorem are actually 100% equivalent using formal logic. It is just the case that as a society, economists have realized that copyrighting mathematical theorems does not really help much economic growth, but copyrighting software does. Okay, so of course, this doesn't mean that awarding legal monopolies to creators of ideas is not a good idea. Indeed, it is. As I just highlighted before, modern economic growth starts in the 18th century, roughly at the same time that we develop a system of patents and copyrights. And I am a strong believer that this coincidence in time is not a random event, that it was precisely because we developed patents and copyrights that we created sufficient incentives to generate new ideas and new research and development. But the good thing about breaking away from the idea of intellectual property as other types of properties is that we can think much more freely about patents and copyrights as a pure implementation problem. What do I mean by a pure implementation problem? What is the optimal structure of these legal rights that will generate outcomes that maximize some measures that we think as a society go to a good societal or a good allocation as a whole. And later on, the other speakers and during the Q&As, we can talk a little bit about what we think those allocations are. And as an economist, I cannot claim any particular or deep insight into the good ends of that allocation. What I can highlight, however, is that research and development requires generating enough incentives for a vaccine to be developed. And that generating those incentives means that we need to depart from standard conditions in economics, like pricing at marginal cost. Does this mean that we need to, for instance, incur in price discrimination? Some people should pay more for the vaccine than others? Should this imply that we should ration the vaccines during the first months when there will be not enough of them based on prices? I think that we can go back to all these ideas later on, but at least I hope I have been able to lay down how I think a relatively mainstream view of research and development from an economist's point of view highlights the tensions that are inherent in any market allocation of vaccines. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Jesus. That was fantastic. So let's now listen to Tana de Campos. Thank you, Tana.
Thank you for this introduction, and thank you for the invitation. As a legal theorist and international lawyer who focuses on global health ethics, I thought I would briefly introduce a Thomistic view of intellectual property rights, and more specifically of medical patents. Intellectual property, or medical patents more specifically, is a special type of private property. Patent rights give exclusionary rights to patent holders, such as pharmaceutical companies and other medical innovators. And this patent protection and the exclusive rights that it contains directly affects the access to and the price of medical treatments. So a patent-protected COVID-19 vaccine would, in principle, be less affordable than a non-patent-protected generic COVID-19 vaccine. And in being less affordable, it's also less accessible to the populations in general. So there's a direct correlation between patent protection and higher prices. And I thought my contribution today could be to introduce the theme of patents from a Thomistic perspective as a way to dialogue with my co-panelists. Now, what would Aquinas have to say about the patent rights applicable to COVID-19 vaccines? He certainly had a lot to say about private property, but not so much about intellectual property or COVID. So what I'll do here is to apply Aquinas' views of private property to the question of whether or not it's just to patent protect COVID-19 vaccines. I argue that for Aquinas, though pharmaceutical companies and medical innovators, generally speaking, have the right as intellectual property holders to fix a price and sell and profit from their own medical innovations in which they invested so much time and money to research and develop, for Aquinas, there are some restrictions to these rights. And this is especially the case if we're talking about an effective COVID-19 vaccine on which a global common good depends. More specifically, I'll argue that for Aquinas, pharmaceutical companies and medical innovators should not patent protect their COVID-19 vaccines, and doing so would be would be unjust in the context of this specific pandemic. And to present this argument, I'll use Aquinas' own methodology. In responding to the question, is it just to make a private property, such as the data related to the research and development and the know-how for producing an approved and effective COVID-19 vaccine? Is it just to make this private property public? I'll first introduce my opponent's views, and my opponents would say, no, it's unjust to make this private property public. Then I'll introduce my response in defending the position that, yes, it is just. So my opponent would bring me two objections to my argument. The first objection is that it seems that Aquinas would fiercely defend private property as a natural right. Aquinas, in question 66, Article 2 of the Secunda, defines property as things that are in principle public. So they at first belong to the common good, as they are commonly owned by the whole of humanity. But these public resources are then made private, and their possession is privately kept by law. Property law, to be more precise, regulates these resources that are subjected to ownership. This is what Aquinas says in his Summa. Therefore, my opponent would conclude here, because Aquinas is a strong defender of private property, he would defend the view that COVID-19 vaccines should be patent protected. Furthermore, and here my opponent would add his second objection, Aquinas says that it's good to have private property and bad not to have it. And it is good because a common resource administered by many tends to be neglected or ineffectively managed. The exclusive right is then justified because it gives the private owner an incentive to foster her own productivity and inventiveness in a way that she can develop her private property to the full as she sees fit. Therefore, my opponent will conclude here, Aquinas would defend that it is good for the COVID-19 vaccine to be patent protected, and the developer of the vaccine should have the liberty to define the prices as she sees fit. However, and here's my answer to my opponent, Aquinas would defend the view that COVID-19 vaccines should not be patent protected, and the developer of such vaccines should not have the liberty to define the price as she sees fit. In fact, I think that Aquinas would say that this is unjust to do so in the context of this specific pandemic. In responding to my opponent's first objection, I would say, yes, it's true that for Aquinas, private property is a natural right. However, it is not an absolute right. Exceptions do apply in the name of the common good. And since property rights are a means of achieving the common good of the whole community, they serve the purpose of commutative justice. And I would add, global commutative justice would justify certain limitations to the rights of the developers of a COVID-19 vaccine. In responding to my opponent's second objection, I would say, yes, it is true that for Aquinas, private property serves the practical purpose of avoiding the problem that we call the tragedy of commons, but property rights exist to properly regulate private ownership by ensuring incentive-based advantage to the owner in harmony with the common good and as a just compensation for the owner's labors. So here, I think that Aquinas would say it is unjust to patent protect an effective and safe COVID-19 vaccine, and the global common good requires this vaccine to be publicly managed because we are experiencing a catastrophe. But that's not to say that the developers of the vaccine should not receive a just compensation for the hard work. Perhaps they would not be able to charge as much as they would desire if what they desire is abusive, but the international community should reward them fairly. So in conclusion, the upshot of this application of Aquinas' theory of private property to the question of patent protection of COVID-19 vaccine is that as a matter of commutative justice and global commutative justice, to be more precise, I have argued that Aquinas would defend making COVID-19 vaccine a generic drug accessible to all populations in all nations at a just price while rewarding fairly the medical innovators. Now, the policy and practical implications of this, including who should be prioritized in the distribution of the vaccine, would have to be further examined. But my point is that these would have to be further discussed, always in reference to the global common good. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Tana. That was a great introduction to the topic and Aquinas' thought. Now we have Dr. John Bushman. Please, John, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Claudio, for the introduction, and to Collegium and PRRUCS for allowing me to be here tonight. Now, just price is in a real sense foreign to us as moderns. We don't come to it naturally. So I'd like to spend most of my time just speaking about the nature of just price, and then to make a case in favor of price discrimination that might satisfy the demands of a Thomistic account of just price. Now, for Aquinas, justice is not a state of affairs, but rather a personal virtue. It is a habit whereby a person renders to each one their due by a constant and perpetual will. Justice is first and foremost in persons, and it is only in a secondary sense that we can speak of just prices. Just price can be considered in two ways. It is the price that a just person would pay, and it is that which is due by right to the other party. For Aquinas, these are the same, and the question for the would-be just person is to figure out what the other person is due. We find Aquinas' clearest statement of just price theory in the Summa Theologia, Secunda Secundae, question 77, article 1, where he asks whether it is lawful to sell a thing for more than it's worth. Now, Aquinas quickly does away with fraud as obviously wrong with a brief reference to Cicero. Would that Enron had had Cicero close at hand. And then he proceeds to the meat of the issue. He begins by considering buying and selling in itself and argues that justice requires equality between the items or item and money exchanged. For Aquinas, this stems from the very nature of exchange as being ordered to the common benefit of both parties. An exchange in which one person benefits substantially more than the other is not best described as being for the common benefit, but rather as being for the benefit of one party. And at stake here, and really in all matters of justice, is the dignity of the other. That is what Aquinas is seeking to preserve. Now, the philosopher Immanuel Kant famously divorced dignity and price in his groundwork for the metaphysics of morals. For Kant, humans have dignity and things have prices. And it's that distinction that helps us to identify the realm of ethics. The unfortunate result is a separation of ethics and economic life, with ethics always approaching commerce from the outside. In contrast, for Aquinas, respect for the dignity of the person is mediated through price, which means that every trade has a moral dimension. Think about this the next time you pick up a carton of milk. Now, there are a host of questions about what constitutes equality in exchange. Some would hope to find it in a cost of production model, and there are some texts that would suggest that. Others would identify the just price with the market price, with clear justification in the text of Thomas. Now, on my own view, I do not think Aquinas gives us a fully fledged account, but rather a series of principles in need of integration. There's work left for us to do. Now, that said, I do think Aquinas held that the market price is frequently, though not always, the just price. Secondarily, Aquinas treats exchanges that accidentally tend to the advantage of one party and to the disadvantage of the other. The situations Aquinas describes here are ones in which an individual's circumstances provide a distinct personal or individual economic value that differs from a general valuation of a good. That is, these are cases in which the seller will experience a special loss if the object is sold, or the buyer will derive extraordinary benefit through the use of the good. Aquinas argues that a seller who needs a good ought to be able to charge more for it is contrary to the notion of exchange that a person should be compelled to sell a good at a loss. For example, the farmer who needs his horse for plowing may charge more if he is prevailed upon to sell at such an inconvenient time as the planting season. To do so will require him to abandon his labor to search for another horse. On the other hand, the need or potential benefit of the buyer has nothing to do with the seller, and the seller is forbidden from deriving any benefit from it. The fact that a buyer is hungry and may die without food does not entitle the merchant to charge any more. This is a question of title. Without title, one cannot derive profit. Now, this situation stands in contrast to how Aquinas treats communal need. Aquinas has no problem with rising prices in times of high demand. He presumes in Article 3 of question 77 that prices will be higher when there is a shortage of grain. Indeed, he does not consider it wrong for the traveling merchant to sell at that high price, even if he knows that other merchants will be arriving shortly with grain that will lower the price. The merchant need not even let the customers know, though if the merchant did so, it would be exceedingly virtuous. Now, how to resolve this tension between the need of the individual and then the communal need? We might see the incorporation of scarcity, our communal need, into pricing as a reflection of our finitude and the reality that our embodiment ties us to a particular place and time with certain resources, but not others. How else to value the contribution of an economic good to human flourishing other than with respect to the good that it brings people? And yet, to attempt to profit off of an individual's particular need, as economists would say, to price discriminate in this way, takes advantage of something that is not one's own. In instrumentalizing the buyer to the seller's profit, the seller destroys the inherent mutuality of exchange. What now can we say about the coronavirus vaccine? I think that whereas dignity in many cases forbids price discrimination, there is a strong case to be made on Thomistic grounds that justice demands price discrimination. Moreover, the demand that equality in exchange be maintained can in fact be fulfilled at the same time. While it is not true that a just price depends upon cost of production, it is true that considering costs of production can tell us something about justice. This is likely particularly true when one is dealing with a monopoly. One has a right, on Aquinas' account, to cover one's costs and also to make a reasonable profit. Now, the devil is in the weasel word reasonable, but we can hash that out later. For most persons, a just price should be the variable cost of the vaccine, some share of the R&D, and that portion of reasonable profit. No doubt, this will be a worthwhile price to pay for the ability to resume our normal activities while avoiding possible death or extreme suffering. The trouble is this: there exists a subset of persons who could pay the albeit negligible variable cost for their vaccine, but who are unable to pay for the variable cost along with a share of those massive fixed costs. To not price discriminate in these instances would be to say that despite making a profit on the particular exchange, one is unwilling to make that exchange because the profit is not large enough. Now, in such an instance, it seems that the character of the exchange has less in common with the merchant in a land of famine and more in common with the seller who wished to profit from the needs of the other. On this read, the dignity of the other demands price discrimination, and yet equality in exchange can be maintained, albeit with differing criteria according to the ability to pay. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, John. That was wonderful. So we have heard all of our speakers today. I think we have a lot of material for a very nice and lively discussion about the issues of developing and allocating this vaccine for coronavirus. So I'm inviting now Tana and Jesus to turn on their cameras so we can start our panel discussion. So I have a question for all of you, which is a question that it's related to innovation and the value of that innovation. So first, I'd like to take a step back before talking about the just price for a healthcare item, such as a vaccine. And let's think about the price of health. So there are many situations, and we have lived in previous pandemics. Think of, for example, AIDS in the 80s. Well, there was no cure for AIDS, nothing that could help you manage the disease, and basically that was a death sentence back then. So basically the price of health at that point in time was infinite. There was no fortune in the world that you could possibly have in order to pay that infinite price to get healthy or to manage the disease, because basically the cure or the drug didn't exist back then. Now when innovation comes, we have new drugs coming in, and now the price of health is lower from infinite to some value, which could sound to us very high. But if you think of recent developments like this drug for little kids that have some genetic disorders, a $2 million drug, and helps them to live longer lives. Well, so lowering the price of health from infinite to 2 million, sounds like a bargain. So the question is, well, your opinion, does lowering the price from infinite to a potentially large monetary value, but that's fine, make that price a just price? Who would like to start?
So I can go first because there is something that maybe we want to keep in mind. Most research and development projects do not succeed. So one really cannot think about, let's suppose Pfizer is the company that ends up being successful, about the research and development cost of Pfizer plus the variable cost of Pfizer plus a reasonable return on the investment. To provide Pfizer to enter into this race, we need to ensure that the expected profit is high enough. Now, if there are 10 people in this race, and let's suppose all of them have the same probability, then Pfizer needs to make, in some sense, 10 times as much of a profit if they are the winner, such that when we multiply by the ex-ante probability, the ex-ante profits are sufficiently high. And that's why we often have prices for vaccines or drugs that can be in the millions of dollars. So in that sense, I think that it's relatively easy to look at, as you were saying, a drug that costs $2 million and feel outraged by it and claim this is not a just price. But when you actually think about the incentives ex ante, you actually need to provide those incentives. Mm-hmm. And in that sense, I agree with Claudio that going from infinity to 2 billion or 2 million is a dramatic change. And an example I often put in class is, imagine a genie will show up to me right now. And this is a credible genie. This is a genie with full commitment. And that genie will tell me, you will never have cancer of any type. You will not have lung cancer, you will not have prostate cancer, you will not have pancreatic cancer. But you need to sign a check for me of $2 million. I will do it in a second. I will not even doubt it for even a millisecond to get that drug. So is that fair? Is that just? John was mentioning before, am I getting enough out of this? Well, definitely yes. I will probably pay even more than $2 million. So that's the sense in which, I'm very sympathetic to the whole idea of the just price. I always have a very difficult time making it operational. That's what I was trying to say.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Well, thank you, Jesus. Tana, would you like to reply to that?
Sure. Just gonna add to the complication that Jesus was alluding to. I think that's correct. That's just a fact that most research and development, most research will fail and will not succeed in any way, shape, or form. So of course, some sort of reward has to be designed to properly reward the innovator. But just to add to the complication, I was thinking about the word health and how you define health. You would think of health as, it's a basic human good, and therefore it is incommensurable. There's no way you can quantify that. And at a medical perspective, I think you would see that it's defined as well-being, right? And I think there are a number of complications that comes with this definition, especially when it comes to apply that definition of well-being or health as the highest attainable standard of complete mental, physical, and social well-being. There causes a number of complications when it comes to apply this definition to laws and policies and how to make that work in real life. But that's just to add the complication of your question and to think about the definition of health itself. It's difficult too.
All right, John?
Yes, so I love Jesus's answer, and part of me just wanted to say that Jesus is sort of a natural Thomist, right? And that exactly what you did is exactly what a Thomist would have done, even though maybe not with the economic terms, right? But you immediately jump to cost of production instead of the demand side, right? Because we have a situation where that side's unclear. And so we think of cost of production and what's legitimate, and then you build up, and it turns out it's a much bigger number than maybe those of us who don't understand that might think, right? So it's counterintuitive, but very true. And so I think a Thomist would have to agree with what you say. Now you still could say, well, okay, so maybe the odds are 1 in 10, so it needs to be at least 10 times. But what if it's 100 times? Like, can we put a cap at some point? and maybe, but that it's helpful to have the cost of production figured out before we could even ask the ethical question of what to do.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Now, the interesting thing is that, well, that large cost of production is sunk after, you have to decide the price. So, the interesting thing here is that basically, it's people's willingness to pay and basically the demand that's actually driving the price that you finally decide what is the just price or not. What do you think about that, John?
So I think, demand is an interesting thing, right? Because it measures people's ability to pay as well as their capacity, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or their capacity to pay as well as their desire to. I think you might be able to say that maximizing profit based on the projected demand curve could lead to unjust consequences in situations where you have wealth disparities preventing people from getting drugs, right? So in an instance where somebody made 40 times maybe the necessary return to incentivize them, but where the demand curve allowed for that pricing, we might say, hey, that's not just. And we'd want to act to change that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So building on John, an example I always use in class is drugs for malaria versus drugs for male impotence. So male impotence, well, it's maybe not that fantastic of a condition to have, but it's not the end of the day when you're in your late 50s. And yet we have plenty of drugs addressing this issue. Drugs for malaria, we don't really have very successful treatments. Something I would like to point out is that in the same way that I was mentioning during my introduction, that this is a situation where since the market doesn't work quite well, or as well as sometimes we think, we can break a little bit about from quote unquote standard answers, we could also think about alternative pricing procedures. And one of them, for instance, with Michael Kramer, who got the Nobel Prize last year, has defended a lot, is governments offering bounties. So something that governments could do is say, look, we are going to give, let's say, $10 billion, no questions asked, to the first company that develops a drug that succeeds according to these medical protocols in addressing illness X. But once you get the $10 billion bounty, the patent disappears, it enters into the public domain, and everyone can produce it at cost. And that to me seems a very attractive approach to solve many, I think, of these ethical problems, although then we will need to think about the ethical problem of how much of a bounty we need to offer.
Yeah, that's right. So that's a great point to introduce my next question. So as Jesus was saying, so we have plenty of drugs for some diseases that are mostly driven by the preferences of wealthy countries, and we don't have solutions to conditions that probably are suffered mostly by poor kids in African countries. So in that sense, we have a trade-off here, right? We have the patent system, which has been very successful, I think, promoting innovation in a decentralized way, connected with people's preferences, right? But there are alternatives to that too. So we could think of the governments centrally deciding where we're going to invest their R&D money and give rewards to people, and then price drugs at marginal cost. But on that kind of system, basically we would be choosing where the R&D money is going to go in a very similar way as industrial policy chooses winners and losers in industry. So what is your opinion about either system? Do you have a favorite? Why? And why do you think one of them could have superior properties in terms of fairness relative to the other? And also, if you could also expand on, do you think any of these would be more appropriate for the current COVID pandemic?
Who wants to go? Tana. You
May
haven't
I
seen much yet.
Yeah, I'll try. I think, Claudio, what you said is important. I mean, I think the current system of patents works very well, and it's very successful for a number of diseases. It doesn't work very well for a number of other diseases, especially those that affect the poorest populations, because in those cases, there's no market incentive for them. One interesting alternative to the system, I don't know, Jesus or Claudio, as economists, what is your take on that? But one that I came across and that I thought was interesting was the Health Impact Fund, where a reward would be calculated based on the impact of the medication, and the impact would be based on how much it benefits the most vulnerable and the poorest who are affected by that particular disease. So I thought that was an interesting alternative, not as a complement to the existing patents regime. Now, Claudio, your question was about a centralized system or a centralized model. I am a huge believer in subsidiarity. So when it comes to, I think in global affairs in general or international law in general, I try to think that a bottom-up approach of decision-making is usually better, and you should try to implement that. Also to involve more the local communities and to, I think, avoid a centralized position coming from above. So I think I would go in that direction of defending subsidiarity and in a global health governance scenario.
Okay.
So let me build on that comment. So since this is supposed to be an Aquinas forum, we can also quote Aristotle, I guess. And Aristotle will say that, of course, the virtue is in the middle. I think that there are many diseases, as Tana was saying, where the patent system probably works very well. And if I were interested, for instance, in incentivizing innovation for oncological treatments, probably a patent system is a very good idea. If we are going to be thinking about tropical diseases, a bounty or a reward, the bounty and the reward is pretty much the same. I was using just bounty because that was actually a lot of innovations in the 18th century were done thanks to bounties by governments. It's kind of an old idea that then we forgot. And this type of reward will probably work very well for tropical diseases of the lower of people with lower income. And I think I will agree with Tana that we should kind of keep an open mind on each case in particular. The problem, though, of the reward system is, and we should also remember that the political process is also manipulated. And something that, for instance, we have observed in a lot of rich countries is the allocation of money from national research foundations. Often it's biased by the power of a interest group that is particularly worried about one disease, which, as terrible as it is for those who suffer it, may only be affecting a relatively small part of the population. And you see this particularly in the case of oncological care, where if you are really trying to maximize the health of the population at large, probably we should be spending more on some types of cancers than on others, but those type of cancers are a little bit less visible. So both systems, both the reward and the patent systems are going to have problems. And I think that this is really a situation where one can a little bit try to be in the middle and decide each case in particular. I will be very reluctant to take a swapping position on all patents, all rewards.
John?
Yeah. So one thing that seems true, no matter which way we go, is that the fundamental question of the price remains. I mean, the bounty is basically a price. One thing that is true about a bounty is that you set it without knowing what the cost of production is. So you have to deal with the demand side question as your sole input. And it at least gives a little bit more power for the government to act, right? Because the government knows, or can more easily regulate, right? You're not messing, you don't have your fingers in to try to direct prices. But I do feel like it raises difficulties because you don't know what the cost of production is. And so you can have a situation where, I mean, Pfizer gets ripped off, which doesn't bother many of us. Like I don't stay awake at night thinking about poor Pfizer, but what if they do? That's a problem.
So let me actually be just a contrarian, if I may. I will actually think that's a feature, not a bug. What do I mean by that? Imagine that we decide, following Tana's suggestion, that we measure that the benefits, and I know that putting dollars and cents on the benefits of health is always very difficult, but we come up with a reasonable measurement that curing disease A is only worth $10 billion. So we say we are going to offer a bounty of $10 billion. And then turns out to be the case that producing a drug costs more than $10 billion. Then as a society, we should not do it. We should be investing our money in something else. I mean, health is fine, but let me put it in this way. I just had a student that went to the market that I was in his dissertation defense like 3 weeks ago. And the point is, think about cancer test screening. If you get screened for some cancers every year, we will detect a few more cancers. But at the end of the day, this will be so costly and so inconvenient for everyone that you don't want to be tested every week. So there is some trade-off about, should we invest in one more drug or should we invest more in schools? And at the margin, you always need to make some choices.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Great. Well, John, you mentioned in your remarks price discrimination. So once we have a vaccine, do you think price discrimination within a country would be a fair thing to do? What about across countries? And so in some countries paying more than others. And in that sense, what the question is, well, is there more than one price that is the just price?
So I do think it's possible to have at least two, right? One where the person's paying, like the impoverished person's paying the variable cost, and one where you're paying the whole, or at least that portion of the fixed costs and presumably a larger percentage of the profit. If that's the case, I mean, you could think of a scale. One of the fears that we might have, like, no one I know is going to go to Kenya to get a cheaper drug, right? Because it's very expensive to get there. But if it were the case that you had a lot of price discrimination right in my town, you could have cases for illicit behavior, right? That might be a concern.
Right. Jesus?
Yeah, so I'm not sure. This is one of those situations where I have been trying to avoid the question, but it comes back to me. Part of me, so if I were teaching public economics, I would probably be saying, set a uniform price, but give vouchers to people who need them to pay for the vaccine. And that's probably a less distortionary approach. So something you could do is to say everyone that makes less than $25,000 will get a voucher for 100% of the vaccine. People making between 25,000 and 50,000 will get a voucher for 50%, and if you make more than $50,000, you will get zero. Of course, exactly. These are just numbers. Okay, I know it's not that I'm. And this will depend really on what is the value of the price of the vaccine, etc. I think that a voucher system is probably a little bit cleaner than price discrimination within a country. I think that among countries, if we are going to do this Mexico versus the US, I think that allowing Pfizer to price the vaccine differently in Mexico and in the US probably makes life a little bit easier and avoids that. We are, in some sense, we already do that. A lot of the fixed cost of research and development in the US, in the world, is paid by the US. That's why a big reason why the US spends more money on health at other countries is because the US is subsidizing the rest of the planet. So when people tell me about how great the Canadian health system is, I always remind them that Canadians are free riders of the Americans, and that it's very easy to be cheap when you're a free rider. But probably is the only way to do it. Like, so I would suggest my favorite solution, and my favorite given some uncertainty, so I'm not 100% sure this is the right thing, will be vouchers within countries for people of lower income and price discrimination among countries.
Anna?
So I actually think there should be, I think the more ethical solution in this case would be to price discriminate not only within countries, but also across countries. And I hope I'll justify my position here. I think within countries, because you would have, of course, you have a variety of different population there affected in different ways, some in more need than others to receive this vaccine. So I think it would make sense to prioritize the most vulnerable population to prevent that they get COVID, while at the same time also discriminating price across country. But now, as Jesus said, this is already happening, right? I think that's even regulated in international law. You have different prices applying to different countries, and I think if I'm not mistaken, 80% of the profit that pharmaceutical companies make come from the US, Germany, and EU in general, and Japan. So only 20% is coming from the global south, let's put it this way. So that's something that already happens, but I think it is justifiable, especially if you're talking about a pandemic situation of scarcity where, you know, there's not enough for everybody. Some sort of prioritization will have to happen in a reasonable way, and I think that would be a way to do it, not only discriminating within countries but also across countries too.
So let me add a small thought on that. So this is a slightly different issue. So one thing is, let's think for a second about the flu vaccine, something that there is enough flu vaccine around. And then there is the problem of how we price the flu vaccine. Should I pay more for the flu vaccine than my graduate student? Okay, and then that will be the price discrimination issue. I think that a slightly different question is, if we only have 10 billion doses in January, let's say, who should be the first 10 million people to get the vaccine? And that's actually an extremely complicated problem, because rationing through price, just giving it to the 10 million people who are going to pay the most, is probably not a very good idea. And let me put my hat as an economist and even forget about ethics for a second. And this is just for the sake of the argument. Infectious diseases have what economists call an externality. If I get the virus and I meet Claudio on the street, I'm increasing his probability of getting the virus as well. So when I'm deciding whether or not to get the vaccine, I'm creating an externality on everyone else. So just letting people decide based on pure income or pure wealth will not lead to an allocation of the 10 million vaccines that will be very good. And then you get into the very subtle problem of who should be the first 10 million people who get that vaccine. And there has been some economists trying to think about that problem a little bit carefully. And it is kind of a complicated problem in addition to it because it's dynamic. And you need to think about, well, probably the first people we want to vaccinate are people in hospitals and things like that. But once you get over the very, very obvious one, who should be the next one is actually quite a tricky problem. And I haven't seen really anyone giving me a very satisfactory answer from a pure technical perspective. Yes, even forgetting about any type of ethical considerations.
Mm-hmm.
May I ask you a question, Jesus?
Sure.
So may I, Claudio?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, so so within countries, you have not enough for everybody. Wouldn't that case be just, or maybe not just, but would it be economically justified to discriminate between, say, for example, we were to prioritize those who are older and therefore would have to be more careful with them, or they would have more interest in being, to receive a preventive treatment like a vaccine. Would it be justifiable then to have set up a population, so say the elderly, those with comorbidities, and vaccinate them first at a very low price, and then have a higher price for those populations that are not that much in risk? And then at the same time, if there is any access in the vaccines, if there is anything left, allocate that to other countries, to the priority population in the other country.
Yeah, so let me take that question in two parts. Let's suppose that we decide that we have like 10 million doses in the US, and let's suppose that we can decide 5 million are going to be for the US and 5 million we are going to donate to the rest of the world. And then we come back to how we discuss that. So I think that my answer would be, first, try to vaccinate those who are particularly exposed. And that's why I was mentioning healthcare workers, policemen, and other first emergency responders. And then my instinct will be to go over the mortality tables. And I know that sounds cold and, you know, the type of things that make everyone hate economists. But so I actually have been estimating mortality tables from COVID. And yes, we have all seen the terrible case of the 20-year-old person who dies of COVID on the news, but it's not really very representative. And in that sense, you know, trying to vaccinate first people over their 80s and then people over their 70s and people over their 60s is probably the most logical approach. The only exception I will make is if we can identify super spreaders. So for instance, will probably make sense to vaccinate young people that work at supermarkets or vaccinate teachers. And so that's a little bit of an exception. With respect to the how many doses we need to give to other countries versus how many doses we need to keep for ourselves, I need to recognize I don't have a very sharp answer. Mm-hmm. So that I don't know. I will need to think a little bit carefully about how to do that. And at this moment, I cannot give you a very good answer, even from a pure technical consideration, because if I'm the US, I also want Mexicans to be covered about this, because otherwise the virus will come back to me. So even if I don't care about Mexicans at all, I may still want to get the Mexicans. I'm sorry, this sounds so bad to say the Mexicans that way. I'm a Spanish speaking, so it's good. I actually have a lot of Mexican relatives. But even if I'm completely selfish, we still want to give some vaccines to our neighbors to protect ourselves from that thing. And that's the type of margin I'm not sure how we will allocate them. Mm-hmm. That I don't know the answer.
Yeah, definitely the fact that it's an infectious disease and spreadable makes externality consideration something that you have to put into the analysis and make it a little more complicated. That's definitely the case. So another thing that we have talked here in your remarks too is, you know, basically the patent system and providing those incentives and so on. And now when firms engage into this R&D activity in order to find the vaccine, well, they discover it, the R&D is sunk, and then we say, hey, you know, this is a really important issue. Coronavirus is something that's affecting lots of people. So actually, you know, we are not going to respect those patents, and we're going to change basically all of your economic prospects that you had in mind when you started the race. So what is your thought in terms of, you know, is that a just thing to do? Is it expropriatory? What does, you know, the ethics tell us? And Jesus, you can also provide us the economist point of view regarding that.
Let me start first as an economist, and then I let Tana and John to say something a little bit deeper and more human. So economists will highlight two ideas. One is the issue of time consistency, that if we expropriate now the pharmaceutical companies, we are creating terrible incentives for the future. So when COVID-25 comes in 2025, Pfizer or Moderna will not like to enter into that race because they will be worried about being expropriated down the tube. So my first instinct is saying you want to provide the right incentives intertemporally. On the other hand, reputations exist to be wasted. That's something I learned from a member of my department who probably taught you, Claudio, George Melath.
Yeah.
And if you accumulate a lot of reputation, it is optimal from time to time to waste it. So maybe this is once in a lifetime event where we want to say, you know, I usually don't drink, but today is, I don't know, my wedding day. Let me get a glass of champagne. I tend to be more in favor of the first view, because I think that most people that say today is the only day I'm going to drink end up drinking every day. But there is a little bit of a case, of an economic case, for saying this is once in a lifetime event.
Well, thank you, Jesus. Tana?
So Jesus talked as an economist, I'll talk as a lawyer, and then John will answer the deep questions then. So I think as a lawyer, I should say there are legal exceptions to patents, but of course, these legal exceptions, they should be, and they always are, limited in time and scope. And that's precisely because that's for an immediate question. Precisely because if you continue to do that in the long term, you will take all the incentives for research and development out of consideration. So that's my 2 cents in the legal aspects of that. I'll let John give the ethical analysis of that.
So the Fed doesn't give us an infinite amount of notice before changing interest rates, right? And what it does, it changes the value of our bonds, which sometimes is good, sometimes not so much, right? And so there is a way in which the government, I think, by being government, has a certain right to alter our prospects. And in fact, if anybody acts, they alter. If any government acts, it alters our prospects. However, I do think there's a matter of justice where firms ought to be able to expect a certain continuity in terms of incentives. And I mean, you can think about this as ultimately an issue of commutative justice, that in the instance where a firm is now going to be losing large amounts of profit, they ought to be compensated. Like when you change the rules of the game, you ought to compensate. And I do think this is one of those instances where, I mean, you could change the rules of the game, but then gradually at some point, I don't know if it's, over 20-year period, you compensate the firm, you make it good. And that might be a way to save our reputation also. Though the debt might be big enough. I don't know. Jesus can tell us that.
Great. Thank you, John. The question I wanted to ask you too, and probably this relates also to John. So there are other institutions that are actually involved in the production and distribution of vaccines beyond just, buyers, sellers, and governments, which is what we've been talking about so far. So there are universities, there are research institutes, there are charities that sometimes try to solve some market imperfections that we have in these markets. So the question is, do these have a role to play in either promoting just prices or alleviating the problems with the current structure? John?
So I don't know the answer to this question, even though I think it's really important. So I was thinking a lot about Elinor Ostrom, whose work on common resource problems is fairly important. And also her writing on prisoner dilemmas, where she said, it's great if you're a prisoner with this particular dilemma, but none of us are actually in prisoner dilemmas. And that if we look at the actual nature of social fabric, there might be opportunities. And I mean, part of me thinks that we ought to be looking at society as more than just government actor and individuals. What could be done? Why aren't charities paying the price? So that's one option, right? We could form. I mean, the Red Cross could do it. We already have charities that could do it, in theory, and we might. I mean, maybe not. I don't know. It might be too expensive for the Red Cross. We could call them and ask, but maybe some of these responsibilities should be shouldered by other organizations.
Mm-hmm. Great.
So isn't it the case that Oxford has already announced that they are going to renounce to all the profits from the patent of the vaccine they are developing? So that's in some sense already happening, no?
So Tana, you are in Oxford, right?
I was.
Literally.
I was. I'm not sure if they decided to not have the patents, but there were some rumors around that. Not only Oxford, but also I think other pharmaceutical companies that were on the game. But what I was going to say is, in global health governance, I think most of the actors are actually non-state actors, and this is the bulk of the governance itself, of global health governance itself. And I think they have a huge role to play in everything that happens. When you think about global health governance, you immediately think about the World Health Organization, because this is the big one, it's on the top. But if you're thinking about people on the ground, you're thinking about this as smaller actors, but they actually have a prominent role in everything that happens. And I think examples there are, for example, universities. They have been very strong. Some of them have been very strong in a movement for access to medicines in general. There are research institutions, a lot of them doing charitable work in terms of sharing research and development and data openly. And there are, of course, charities. So I think they do play an important role, especially on the ground, and especially with local communities, especially in terms of advocacy and education.
Great. So we have some very interesting questions also from our audience. So let me get to those questions too. So Mike Dejos is a pharmacy doctor. His question is, how would we define to reward the COVID-19 vaccine innovators fairly? I think that's probably more related to your remarks, John.
Yeah, well, I do think that, as Jesus was talking about earlier, the cost of production, right? We should figure out what the odds were of getting the vaccine. We should figure out how much it cost to actually do the development, and we should run those numbers. Now, I don't know what it would be. Obviously, I mean, I would hope it would have to be much higher than the rate of return that the S&P 500 gives us, right? It's going to be a big number because of the very big risk that they're taking, and I think that's fine. I think it should be big. As far as numbers, I'm a theologian, so we don't actually use real numbers. There's one God, three persons. That's the numbers for me.
Sounds good. All right, we have another question from Pat O'Grady that says, once you decide on a just price, what do you do for people or countries that can afford even that price? So
Aquinas does have an option. So not every exchange has to be a sale. There can be gifts. In fact, in the hierarchy of virtuous actions, a gift is better than a sale. It's more noble. It's an act of charity. It's not an act of justice. Although there can be, in extreme need, an instance where somebody can literally take somebody else's food and eat it. If you're starving, that's not theft, Aquinas says. So I think in these instances, the charity can be expected, actually required. Now the question is, who gives it? And I think, so Catholics love empire. We can't say that we do, but we do, right? We love it. We love things like the United Nations because it's an order that sits above the national orders. We don't want them to do all that much, but we need them there in order to handle certain situations like this one. I think there should be something to be said for international responsibility to pay for these situations. Although, I mean, the US could do it too, as often happens.
Let me add something over there. I think that this is a case, coming back to my point about externality, where even a selfish country should be interested in distributing the vaccine worldwide. Because look at what happens with New Zealand. They were able to eliminate COVID within New Zealand, and then now every week they kind of get someone sneaking in again with some COVID. So if I were New Zealander, even if I have completely eliminated COVID-19 in my own country, I will be more than willing to pay several $1,000s to be sure, just me individually, to be sure that the rest of the planet gets rid of COVID, so I don't need to live in this constant fear that one more case is going to sneak through the frontiers. So in that sense, I think that even from a pure selfish perspective, being sure everyone gets vaccinated, let's say within the next 3 years, makes a lot of sense in the world. It's just from a pure economic perspective, it just makes all the sense of the world.
Yeah, so John gave the ethical justification for that, and Jesus gave the economics of self-interest there. I think legally, there has been a lot of argument there for a legal duty to cooperate in those circumstances too. So tying the ethical and the economics too would be the law trying to enforce a legal duty to cooperate based on solidarity among countries.
In fact, I'm more worried about people not wanting the vaccine even when they can afford it than the other way around. I think that maybe the conversation should be, do we have the right to stop people in the street and vaccinating them even if we don't want it?
Very good. And I think we have time for a last question here from Janet. She's asking to all, but especially John. So you're a special guy, John. She says, has pricing, tier or not, of the COVID-19 vaccine been specifically addressed by AstraZeneca, J&J, or Moderna? Do you think the pricing will ensure a greater or lesser reasonable profit or an actual reasonable loss for the producers?
So I did read a handful of statements, or rather news articles summarizing statements that have been made, and they all said the right things, which of course, I mean, if I were a CEO, I would say the right things too, right? That would be my job, is to say the right things. I honestly don't know exactly, beyond the fact that it seemed like they were saying the right things, and then the question is, do you do the right things? Which is a different question.
Great. Jesus, you want to say?
So my brother is a PR for the Spanish pharmaceutical lobby. And building on what John was saying, he will pen a press release in the next 60 minutes where he will cross all the boxes, dot all the T's, dot all the I's, where everything is perfect. Also, a big pharmaceutical company is going to be really, really good at accounting. And that's the only thing that worries me a little bit when John was saying about cost plus some reasonable benefit. I took a lot of years of accounting in college, and I deal with budgets all the time because of my job. Budgets are fuzzy things. We tend to believe that budgets are like mathematical theorems. Not really. And in that sense, I'm pretty sure that whatever the companies say, they are going to make a pretty penny out of this.
Yeah, I'm a lawyer, so I shouldn't talk about numbers because I'm absolutely ignorant when it comes to numbers. But the only thing I want to add is I'm assuming that companies will make enough money, even if they, out of charity, donate the vaccine without any patents. And also, I'm thinking about that because they could, in terms of corporate social responsibility, they could make up for the bad image that pharmaceutical companies usually have, and in that way, perhaps gain trust back and somehow their reputation back, and that might have some economic implications on that too.
Great. And I think we still have time for one last question here from Dan Chile. Dan says, we live in an era of what's being called surveillance capitalism and have become increasingly aware of the dangers associated with that. However, is there any just way that the health and financial data collected on each person can be used to determine a just marginal price for each person for basic human goods, including perhaps vaccines from severely infectious diseases? Sounds potentially frightening, but perhaps worth discussing. That's a great question from them.
We already have that system. It's called Amazon, who very carefully, since and they hire a substantial number of Penn economic graduates. They spent a lot of time trying to figure that out. Of course, it's not with vaccines, but with and the light bulbs you are going to buy tonight, since they will probably offer me a different price that they will offer Claudio based on our purchases over the last 6 months. And if anyone who doubts that, try to check for the same price after cleaning your cookies and using a different IP address, and you will see very different prices for the same good. I'm a big believer in big data, and I think there is a lot to be gained out of it, but I also share Daniel's concern about privacy issues. Nonetheless, I have been very, very impressed by both China and Taiwan, China being an authoritarian dictatorship and Taiwan being a democracy, ability to use big data extremely effectively to control the infection without the need of a vaccine. And for good or for bad, I think that the world should be paying way more attention to China and to Taiwan right now. And I think that in the US, we tend to be extremely narcissistic, thinking that the only thing that matters is November election, when maybe the future is really being determined in Taiwan.
Okay. Tana?
That's a tough one, because I do fear for protection of private data, and I think that's an important concern. I think the question is how much to protect if the common good needs you to disclose certain information. I think that's a tough one. That's a tough one on how to balance those two. I was going to say something else, but I forget now. I'll let John, and then
let's let John, and then maybe we come back to you.
Yeah, I don't know what I think about a right to privacy. I mean, it's a sort of expectation that, I mean, Aquinas wouldn't have had to worry about it because you wouldn't have been able to surveil someone to anywhere near this degree. It wouldn't have been a problem. But there might be something problematic about trying to play God, which can happen when we have so many numbers that we think, we can work things down to the tiniest details, and we might forget what the overall aim is, which could detract. I don't know, but I think it's terrifying to me, but at the same time, I don't know that we have a right to privacy, because in theory, one should live one's life that details wouldn't matter if they got out, right? One would hope.
Okay. Yes, let me think about the following example, maybe to build on John. Imagine that this virus, instead of killing, so the fatality case ratio now I think is around 1%, depends a little bit, of course, on the demographics of each country. Imagine that the fatality ratio was 25%. So 1 of each 4 persons died, which, is not that different from the Black Death, which was probably around 40%. Then I think all of us will agree that the common good, given that this is an infectious disease, will require absolute disclosure. Mm-hmm. Is 1% tough enough or not, high enough or not for disclosure? If it was 0.00001%, probably the answer will be no. So where is the cutoff? And to that, I don't have an answer.
Mm-hmm.
But is there a cutoff? Because how can you quantify, for example, when I'm thinking about privacy, I'm thinking, for example, about the medical duty to confidentiality, for example. Can you quantify that?
Okay, but okay, so I think that my point over here really relies on the infectious aspect of the disease. Okay, if this was a cancer, then yes, I'm a big supporter of the idea that cancer is your own personal problem and you don't really have, and you say, look, I don't want to share my information because I don't want to help development better ecological treatments for the future. Yeah, I think in that case, you should have that right. I think that here the issue is, the problem is if I go to the street, I'm passing this to someone else. And that's where I think, if you commit yourself to, hide yourself in a monastery for the next 40 years and never talk with anyone else, then yes, you can have all the confidentiality in the world you want. But if you want to show up in a restaurant and I'm in the restaurant, I'm not so sure you have that right. It's really the fact that we live in a, again, coming back to Aristotle, that we are a zoon politikon, that changes the thing over here of the answer.
So because you're giving the example of a communicable disease, yes, that would justify violating some basic human rights, including freedom of movement, freedom of expression, that might be tied to.
But all human rights are subject to limits. We don't think that any human right is absolute. So in that sense, the issue is, where do we put the frontier? Freedom of speech, we have limitations for libel, we have limitations for security concerns, etc. The issue is, where do you trace the line? And for me, when it's a communicable disease, the line should be in a different place than if this is an oncological, if it's a cancer.
Well, we're about to finish, so let me wrap up here and thank our panelists. This was a wonderful discussion, and I think the richness of having different disciplines talking about the same issue is something that we should definitely do more often, because as I said at the beginning in the introduction, I don't think a particular field or a single field has all the answers. So this has been a great discussion. Thank you so much. And now I'm going to leave you with Mike King, who will close the seminar and give you some additional invitations for future events.
Great. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you very much, Claudio, for moderating, and thanks to everyone for joining. Really appreciate your signing into this. It's a really fascinating and timely topic. So I'd like to close by inviting you to the next panel discussion that Collegium is putting on together with PRRUCS, which is a Magi project forum on can consciousness be manufactured? And we're hosting two Stanford neuroscientists on November 17th at 7 p.m. So you'll see a link for that in the chat, and it's also available on the Collegium website. We'd love for you to join us in that and spread the word. Thanks again for joining us tonight.